they check the computer again, and the computer says, state of Texas sets you free. We have to get you out of here. We have to release you. So I started the journey. I walked 300 miles back to Dallas. God told me, he says, now walk. Don't put my name in your mouth. Just go show the world who I am.
Hello and welcome back to The Uncomfortable Truth. We're glad to have you today. We've got a special guest. We're super excited about this guy, Michael Molthan, motivational speaker, author, show host of M to the Rock. But when you just boil it down, it's a dude that loves Jesus and wants to show Christ's love to everybody. Michael, welcome to the show, brother.
Man, I'm so excited to be here. What a setup y'all got here.
Well, this is we always just credit Rich. Rich is the guy behind the camera who just makes everybody look good.
I mean, we're out here in East Texas, a population of 8.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this studio is worth more than the town.
People have made comments of how we look on the show, right? And I would consider myself maybe a solid 6, on the show. But if you see me in person, you'll be like, man, that dude's a 2.
No, that's not true. That's not true. In fact, when I met you outside the studio, I was like going, man, it's good. I thought you were going to be like a midget.
Well, I'm 56 years old, just turned 56. I'm kidding. He believed me.
Well, I'm 56.
Okay, you are?
Yeah, I just turned 56.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well,
You look great for a 56.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
I appreciate you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I should have went higher. So he was like, no way you're 72.
How old are you?
42.
My man.
Okay. Man, let's get into your story because you've had a crazy life. And I've been researching you. Obi's been researching you.
Oh, yeah.
Let's start at the beginning because that's normally where our stories start, right? And where the beginning of our testimonies and where we start experiencing life. What's the first thing that you remember as a child?
Wow, it's I can't wait to hear what I'm about to say. Right? Excuse me, and I'm glad that this is going to be a 19-hour show.
Yeah, we're gonna go. We're going way back.
I mean, I was clean shaved when I got here, right?
Yeah.
It's I was born in New Braunfels, Texas, down in South Texas Hill Country area, and in 1969, and we immediately moved to Plano, Texas, in early 1970, and that's where we landed. And I've been in, was in Plano kindergarten through 12th grade, and and I had a good, a normal. Let me rephrase this. Mom and dad were married. Have a little brother. Very structured routine. And my dad became very, very successful businessman in the furniture industry. And, he's a workaholic. He was always gone. And my mom was, a stay-at-home mom. And I was a very, very creative, high energetic kid. And my brother, I say he was an L7, which is a square, but he just kind of stayed in his lane. It was very easy.
That's how a creative person views an L7, right?
Yeah, L7.
It's like you got no personality.
Yeah, no. And so I was high maintenance, back then. So they didn't have ADD and all that stuff. It was high maintenance, and so to calm the kid down led to spankings, and the spankings got worse. And I grew up with a mom who I believe struggles with addiction and alcoholism. The frustrating thing about alcoholism and addiction is it's the only disease on the planet that unfortunately has to be self-diagnosed. So I don't have the power to say that anybody's an alcoholic or a drug addict, but their behaviors, if they bother me or concern me, and the reason why it does is because I do it or I did it. So, growing up, it was very confusing because behind closed doors, it was crazy. But outside and going to the country clubs and growing up playing golf and being provided everything that I needed and want, nice stuff and big house. And, I grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. I grew up in a very wealthy family.
Right.
And
It's an interesting way to put that.
yeah. And so behind closed doors, it was very confusing. from the day I was born that I could start remembering things. My grandfather on my mom's side was sexually abusing me, behind closed doors.
That's as far back as you can remember.
Yeah, I mean, it's ingrained in my head. This is what he was, doing to me, and so this trauma that was happening, and then the physical abuse from my mom and dad, and the verbal abuse. I was a very confused child. So outside, I would hide it, and I was very active and, fun and all this stuff, and became a very good golfer and growing up in the country clubs. And the men in the locker rooms actually became the men who raised me. They taught me how to drink, they taught me how to gamble, they taught me how to play golf, and they were teaching me how to die, at the end of the day. And my parents would always say, they always talked so bad about my grandfather, but yet he would come over, he would babysit, he was always around us, but we'd leave. He was a raging alcoholic, and he was a border patrol officer. My parents are from the valley, McAllen, down in the border, and so he was a border patrol officer, and they always said that, and just talk bad about him. Little did they know what he was doing to me. That only was between him and I. And I mean, he would take me fishing without a fishing pole. There were no fishing poles in the car. So without all the details, it was criminal, it was wrong, and it was horrible.
How much of your childhood did that span?
It was kindergarten through fifth grade, and then he died of throat cancer from alcoholism. I used to watch him, beat my grandmother like a man. Beat her up and down to the ground. And
when he died, what emotions do you remember feeling?
That's a good question. It was, I'll never forget when he was laying there in the bed and half his head was off from the surgery. They were transporting stuff to throat. I was forced to go in there because my mom and dad, they didn't know. They said, you come in here and see your grandfather. He wants to see you. Because he was always prowling and following me. And I mean, without getting into details, it was just eerie, And before I answer that question, my parents would always say, "You're just like your grandfather."
So they talked bad about him.
Yeah.
That he did terrible things to you, and they said, "You're just like him."
You're just like him. And they said your mannerisms, your hands, your fingers, and they were right. I mean, I look at and I have really unique penmanship. He had beautiful handwriting, and growing up in school, I always won the handwriting awards. I had perfect penmanship.
Man, that must be nice.
And
I'm looking down. I can't even read my own writing.
But it's so they were saying all this stuff, and I'm like, I don't want to grow up to be like him. You don't have a clue. And my mom battled with serious depression all the time, and so I was always being funny around the house and cracking jokes, and I was trying to make everybody else feel good because I was so focused on removing everybody else's pain and suffering. And that, looking through a different perspective today is now my gift. But I was trying to help others already because I was trying to do anything I could to change the way I felt. Right. Until I had my first sip of alcohol when I was 10 years old. But to answer your question, so how I felt is at that time, I did not want to go in there. And no one, why? Get in there. You're being selfish. And so I went in there. I'll never forget this. I couldn't feel my legs. And his hand was here. And she says, my mom's like, hold his hand, I mean, and so I grabbed his hand and he turned over and just looked at me. His eyes were black, literally black. And I fainted. I literally physically fainted.
Your body could not handle the emotions that you were
because
feeling.
he really looked like a monster.
And that was 10 years old. You were 10 years old.
Something like that.
11 maybe.
Yeah, fifth grade, whatever age that is.
I can't imagine going through that as a fifth grader and all the emotions. Yesterday, I was at my grandma's house. She's in her last days. And having that moment with her, of like holding her hand, she can't say a whole lot. The amount of love that's transferred back as a 42-year-old, realizing the life that she's had and processing that in a good way.
Right.
Is still not easy.
Yeah.
And then as a young kid, not even knowing really how to explain what's going on, what you're feeling. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and so my whole life, I mean, I never did slumber parties. Even to this day, um, it's not a battle. I recognize it's just so ingrained as a habit. I mean, even in my own house, and there's no one there, I still lock the bathroom door. Because he would come in while I was taking a shower and go in the bathroom, and it's all these boundaries that were crossed that didn't feel right, and they weren't right, and so it's it's a trauma it's real trauma. So I was always confused and trying to ease the pain and suffering from trauma. And I was my whole life, I was seeking visible things to fix my invisible problems. And, it gets better as we talk about it more, because when I share my story, it was what it was like. Then what happened? All right. And what's my life like today? And I very rarely share my story today on podcasts because it's out there so much. But I want to do that for y'all here because, we've got the time to do it, and I want your audience to hear it. Because right now, as we're starting and we're talking, like, oh, God, that poor guy.
Yeah.
And, let's take cardboard boxes and put them on sticks and let's go campaign, kill all child molesters. That's not that's not my mission. My mission is to share my story today as a result of forgiveness, true forgiveness of the amazing things that God is using that same grandfather to this day to save lives.
That's super super interesting and awesome that you have eventually got to that point of where your trauma turned into this testimony, but your story didn't stop there.
No, yeah.
It continued, not necessarily down the best path. It began, those emotions and all of that trauma led to more tests before the testimony came out. Can you kind of tell us the next steps in your life?
So, I started drinking, at 10 years old, and I had my first drink, and I mean, I wasn't drinking a 6-pack the next day. I loved the taste of it. And then I felt something happened. I just felt something was happening. And then I realized as I was drinking alcohol, I started feeling like everybody around me looked. Okay. My insides were matching their outsides. And I'm like, okay, this is the missing piece. And
because it slowed you down?
It gave me a sense of ease and comfort.
Yeah.
And yes, slowed me down. I have I speak on doctor trauma, on kids that, their parents send them to doctors to fix them, give them meds, give them ADHD meds and all this stuff. And, that's what my mom did, fix them, fix them, fix them. And so I started getting stuff in me that, all these chemicals. So I was always self-medicating. And I was self-medicating on everything. So when I speak, it's like we hear the word addiction, right? What is it? I love word studies. Like, what is addiction? What does it mean? And so when we think of addiction, we automatically think of drug addicts and alcoholics, right? You think of the $2 needle junkie under the bridge or the alcoholic under the bridge, right? Well, today I realized the only difference between me and the man underneath the bridge is one thing: that's the bridge, right? And I was both sides. I had a company. I started working very early. My dad, at the age of 9, said, "Go start a company," but I wanted to go work. I loved working and making money, and became very successful in the business world as a home builder. I went from high school to the pro golf tour. I caddied on the pro golf tour for the best golfer in the world. Perfect for an alcoholic and drug addict.
Yeah.
I was the popular guy in the men's locker room. I was young, but I was hanging out with very successful businessmen and their lifestyles, and I played golf with those guys because I could play, with them, and took it to the tour and caddied for Lanny Watkins on the pro golf tour at his prime. And so it was incredible. I was a bookie on the tour, real quick. But at a young age, I was diagnosed as very smart. I mean, I don't know what genius means, but they said it's like this genius IQ, level. And I'm twin brain, so I got the business brain and I have very creative brain.
That's pretty rare.
Very
to
rare.
have like high levels of function on both sides.
Right. but it's a disability too.
Okay.
Because, for example, and I struggle with it in the M to the Rock platform, because being a new creature in Christ and serving others and being selfless, Satan will go to my left side of the brain, the business part of it, to make it work. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because the hustle's gone, right?
Oh, we could talk about that all day.
All day.
Yeah.
We could talk about that all day. It's like the service of like serving others, but how do I build that into a long-term business that makes money? Well, it's not about the money. It's about over here. It's about serving people. Well, how am I going to survive?
Yeah.
It's like back and forth, back and forth. It's like ping pong in your head.
It's called spiritual warfare.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, and it's so that's been a really learning experience for me over the last 8 years, because my business, is one of the most well-known high-end luxury home builders in the Dallas Fort Worth area and the Park Cities and down there, and for 20 years, we did complicated, huge projects and love it. I grew up and love real estate and love home building, and I love the creative part of it. So back to addiction. What is it? What is the definition of it? Here it is. Addiction is the street name for spiritual stronghold. That's what it is. It is the street name for spiritual stronghold. So let's just go a little deeper. Let's break that down. Addiction is a person, place, thing, and here's a scary one, or a thought that has become my source. So with that said, if you're breathing oxygen, everyone is an addict.
Right.
Okay. And so, I want to help remove the stigma from drug addicts and alcoholics and family members. Why do family members get so frustrated and say, oh my God, he's just a drug addict, alcoholic. We'll just put him over here. Okay. And they're frustrated with him. Well, the reason why they get frustrated is because they actually see their own character defects live on stage, and it scares them. They don't drink and do drugs, but their other visible addictions, is there. So it scares the parent. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that makes sense is that as a result of forgiveness, and today as I look at life through God's perspective, not mine, not the world or not the cultures, right? I look at it through God's perspective. I was able to forgive my mom because what she was really saying, she was scared because she was seeing herself in me. She didn't see it in my brother because we're different. I was her clone. She was seeing herself in me, and on top of that, she was seeing her father in me.
Right.
So out of fear and lack of faith and no spirituality, she's left to her own devices. So hitting and the beating and the screaming and throwing things at me and all this stuff, it was all fear-based. Is it okay? No, but it gave me a better understanding of forgiving. So now I get to use that today to share on platforms like this to help other moms and stuff like that, going, okay, I see that. Mm-hmm. And so as we break it down that deep, that's seeing it from the spiritual realm. See, my whole life I wanted to be smart, successful. That was my source. And knew nothing about spirituality because I try to outsmart it. I try, that's our world today is trying to get more educated, and they're less spiritual.
For sure.
And so that's kind of working up to that, and then I married my childhood best friend since kindergarten. We were best friends.
Oh wow!
And she was our CFO, ran the business. Her dad is architectural engineer, civil engineer. He owned a huge commercial construction company. He retired very early, sold it for a lot of money, and so he really groomed me from the business side of it. And in 2000, I had two boys that, I made the decision that it was my responsibility to change the cycle. And I wanted to be a really good dad. Now, I'm not a believer. Okay. I'm not a believer. I'm agnostic, but Casper the Friendly Ghost. I mean, come on, guys. I mean, it's witchcraft, what y'all are talking
Santa
about.
Claus in the sky.
Yeah, God spoke to me. You're tripping on acid.
Mm-hmm.
You need to go see a therapist. You know what I mean? Right. And stuff like that. So, but I ran an honest business. I wasn't, I had my own problems. And every visible thing was my source. So in 2009, my wife collapsed with a massive brain hemorrhage out the clear blue. And that's where my life really took a change because prior to that, in 2002, I started, seeking help, trying to get help, different treatment centers. I always check it out to make sure it was nice and polished because I didn't want to be like the man underneath the bridge, right? You remember the story? And so I went to Betty Ford in 2002. And the reason why I say Betty Ford and not treatment, I want everybody to know I went to Betty Ford because that's where important people like me go.
Right.
That's how what I thought of myself, that ego and pride.
What was your basis of building your? You said you weren't a Christian. You thought it was all hoopla. What was your basis of building principles up until that point?
Well, my dad, I learned a lot from my dad, watching him, and he was good to people. He ran a good business. I was one of those guys. There's right and wrong, and I was practicing one of the 10 Commandments and didn't even know it. Treat people like you want to be treated. That just felt right. But giving my life to Christ, as smart as I am, and when I would hear that, I couldn't process it. I mean, it lasted in my brain for a half a second.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I just couldn't process it.
You're open to the thought, but then that makes zero sense to you at the time.
Makes zero sense. I didn't even think about it enough to make the conclusion that it made zero sense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, let's talk about the cost of eggs in Africa.
Right.
No, I got to go.
Yeah.
It's so, but it's amazing that you got me thinking. It's amazing the way that I used to think, and the way my best thinking got me right here on this podcast. Where my life is today, it's not even close to my game plan. Even today, I mean, 8 years later, I'm like going,
what are we doing, Lord?
What am I doing?
It's day by day, right?
Yeah, I'm talking to Luke Hokenjos, lives in the sticks in Louisiana. He's become a very close friend of mine. I know he's on your show. I love that man. And, driving out here to, hang out with y'all to talk. And,
isn't that most of businessmen struggle? I feel like that we get inundated. We're one track. We're focused on growing, making more money, glorifying ourselves. How can we accomplish more so that we're seen more, we're recognized, we're affirmed? And there's a point when you're in the climax of that, the thought of surrendering that to the Lord is just nowhere to be found.
It is. I just remember this when you asked me this. I remember I was at a luncheon one time, in the business world, and they had a speaker up there, and he was talking about, and he tells this story how he literally gives 100% of his income every year to the Lord, and I'm like, and where are you going with this? And then he says, and the next year, my income doubled. And I'm like, you're going to sit there and lie to me? You know what I mean? And it just, that right there. And he was passionate about it. And I'm like, I'm like, it made no sense to me. And it wasn't a prosperity gospel speech. I mean, this guy was solid.
Business. Yeah.
He was solid. I mean,
Were you thinking like, who hired this guy to come speak to us?
This makes absolutely no sense to me.
Right.
You know what I mean? I just invested $15 million in a piece of land, and I want my EBITDA to be, 14% return. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like he's sitting there going, I just gave it all to the Lord, and he gave me back half of it. Luke's got those stories.
Yes, he does.
And
his last podcast that was released was specifically talking about this.
I watched that, and I mean, he hasn't even told you. He tells me, I mean, literally when this stuff happens, Luke will call me and go, "Man, you're not going to believe this."
Yeah.
I was cutting firewood, and the Lord spoke to me, and He said, "There's a lady that's 3 miles away that lives on the corner of in that white house, the blue front door, and she needs a truck, and you need to go to the other house and go pick up that truck because they're going to have the title in it signed already." And I mean,
it's that detailed.
He tells me the story, and I'm like, "What?"
And then it happens.
And the cool thing is, I call him with my stories too.
Yeah.
Because it's cool because how real, God works. So now I'm that guy that, am I giving 100% of my income to the Lord? Nope, I'm not. But I remember that. I remember
Mm-hmm.
that speech. I can tell you this: I'm giving 100% of my time to the Lord,
Yeah.
Right.
and it's
Right.
painful, and it's painful. So, anyways, the disease gets, worse and worse. I'll never forget it, Betty Ford. When I was there, one really cool thing about it is I'm walking down the hallway, and this my counselor walks by, and he's this real skinny African American guy. And remember, the reason why I'm saying these African Americans, a big part of my story, because I grew up in a culture that was all white,
Mm.
um, and so, and I had nothing against it. You know what I mean? It was, and he said to me, he goes, um, can I talk to you for a second?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "You got a really good spirit and personality about you." I said, "Well," I said, "Thanks, man." He says, "If you really want to get sober, all right, step three, the sooner you do step three, you will have a life like no other." And as he's saying this, I'm looking over his shoulder and I can see the 12 steps. And in step three, it says, "Made a decision to turn my will and life over to the care of God as I understand them." And right when I saw God, I'm like, I check out. All
Mm-hmm.
right. And I go, "Hey, I'm the client, you're the counselor. I appreciate that. I appreciate that ain't happening." Okay. And he says, "It's going to be very painful." This is in 2002. All right. And he says, "Let me ask you something." Okay. I said, "Okay." He says, "You talk about your boys in group all the time. That's all you talk about. And it's real. Everybody's engaged. I mean, you love these boys. It is a parent. You have made a decision that you want to be a great father for these boys." And he says, "You said something that was so powerful in group. It's not about money.